When you were younger, you were most likely taught that Easter is about the death and the resurrection of Christ. But the symbols of Easter, they tell a different story. Because if we look at what we do around Easter, we decorate and paint eggs, we light fires, we bring branches of primarily birch into our houses. And then there's the rabbit, the Easter bunny. Somehow all of these has become central symbols of Easter. And that alone should make you wonder how this came to be. In order to understand this, we need to go back in time. Quite a lot of time needs to pass. And we need to try to understand how people back then viewed the world. Because the world in pre-Christian society wasn't seen as something stable or a continuation. This was a world of seasons, and the season of winter was a real threat to you and your tribe. Winter was associated to death itself, and there were no guarantees that you and your kin would survive it. But at the moment as winter started to lose its grip on society, that moment really mattered to the ancestors. And this was not a symbolic thing. This was a very physical thing. The world itself was changing, and people responded to this change when winter dropped its claws from the grip, so to speak. And if we look at the fire aspect of Easter, fire wasn't primarily for celebrations. It was for protection, because these transitions between seasons were deemed as something quite dangerous, because the boundaries themselves between the worlds weakened during these periods of times. And what did not belong in this world could move freely in between these worlds. And what later became the stories about the witches, which we up until this day in the Nordics have a lot of around Easter, since the children oftentimes they wear makeup and dress up like witches. And the stories about the witches was that you light fires in order to not let them into your farm or household, so to speak, because the witches were afraid of the fire. So the fires themselves can probably be tracked back to the wild hunt, I would argue, and that you had these land spirits that you wanted to detract with lighting fires in order to not let them pass through the realms, so to speak. And then if we talk about the time and the cycle of time, I mentioned before that the Norse or the Fenuscandic world didn't view time as linear but cyclical, because everything in life was understood in cycles. Death followed by a return, just like in Ragnarök, and darkness is always followed by light. And winter which was the manifestation of death, was followed by life. And around this moment, around Easter, there was the turning point back into the cyclical of life itself. And if you know your calendar studies, you will see that Easter has a tendency to always shift in timing, which is a bit curious. If we look at the premise we celebrate Easter now, which should be the death of Christ, but it's funny how that date tends to shift every year. So no, this has more to do about the moon cycles than anything else. Even the name for Easter is a conundrum in some ways. It seems to be split in two directions. In most parts of Europe, it's called påsk, or derivatives of it, Pascha, Pexa, and all from a story from the Near East, but in English and in German, Easter or Ostern, names that are probably linked back to Ostre, a figure tied to dawn in early pagan beliefs. And not only dawn, but the rising of light itself. So even the word itself of Eastern and Påsk, you are looking at two different origins altogether. And in the old world, or the pagan world view, you could say, you have to understand that they had a bit different way of looking at the world. The world wasn't a stable continuation of time. It was not predictable in that sense. The world was alive, and the return of the light was not only about weather, it was something that was happening. Whether you called it a force, a presence, or a goddess, it didn't really matter. What mattered was that the light returned, and so did the life. And the symbolism of the egg itself is the symbol of life itself, you could say. And the hare, or the rabbit, is, I think it's the perfect embodiment of rapid reproduction, because they have a tendency to explode in terms of populations. And as the land tends to become more alive, it multiplies rapidly. So it's unmistakably so that the hare and the egg represents fertility. Sorry about that. And so they became symbols for these particular things. So, and not by choice, but through observation of life itself. The world is returning, and the hare starts to show you that in real life. But like I began in the video, Christianity arrived to the Northern Hemisphere, and it brought a story about death and resurrection. But if we look at the structure of this story, it shares exactly the same pattern. What happens in nature and how it's now expressed in a narrative instead. The return of life became the return of Christ. So this isn't really a contradiction. It's an alignment of what's definitely true from a natural sense into the Christian lore of the death and resurrection of Christ. And we can see this pattern throughout many of the so-called Christian traditions. I've talked about this around Yule as well, as an example. But like I said, it's an alignment of stories and patterns, and the cycle itself was already there, and the symbols were already there as well, and the timing was already there, like I said, around the moon cycles. And what actually changed throughout time is the explanatory story around it, I guess we could say. So Easter isn't just about the resurrection. It's a celebration of the return of life itself and the turning of the cycle. So it's about life after death, and it's about light after the darkness. And Christianity did not invent this pattern. It gave it a different story. But if you look closely, the older meaning is still there for whoever is prepared to watch. And the thing is that this is not a hidden gem in that sense. It's just remembered differently. But when you celebrate Easter, please remember that this is very heavily pagan from the beginning. Okay, folks, thank you for watching. I wish you all a lovely Easter, and I talk to you later. Tyrdom out.